y'all hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. My name's Caitlin, and the title of my talk, what I'm going to talk about is intentional deployment best practices for managing your feature flags. And I know you guys are all like, oh my God, that's such a great title. Like, you did such a good job, and you're right. But what does that mean? So let's talk about it. So intention, right? Like doing what you meant to do. That's what we're aiming for, right? So usually we're writing code with intention. Usually, like, I don't know about you, but how many of you guys like just bang your keyboard on your standing desk and like perfectly syntactical Python just like shoots out, right? Nobody does that. Okay, it's like not how we're doing it, right? So we're writing code, we're testing code, we're reviewing code, we're doing a lot of things to make sure that the code that we're writing does what we want it to do, right? And then it gets ready, like it gets time to launch this beautiful little piece of code that you wrote into the world, and we think maybe we should be intentional about that as well, right? Probably sounds logical. Okay, so what's an easy way to do this? Not everybody has like fancy CI/CD canary systems, or even if you do, what's a super easy way for you to have total control of your feature after it's out into the world? A feature flag, right? So a feature flag is like basically a light switch. You wrap your code in it, and super simple. If the feature flag is on, we're going to do something, and otherwise, we're going to do something else, right? Very simple. Nobody's confused, I hope. So what does that process look like, right? So you wrote this code. It's great. It's awesome. We're going to put it behind a feature flag, and then we're going to pretend that maybe in this scenario, your feature flag is a rollout, right? So you want to roll this feature out to some percentage of people. This user was the lucky one, got your feature flag is on for them, doing great, they see the feature. This user, not so lucky, didn't get the feature's off, everybody's happy. Okay, so you had this amazing idea, you wrapped it in a feature flag, everything is great. The issue is everybody else at your company had the same idea. So, yeah. So when feature flag becomes feature flags, that's when we start to get into a little bit of an issue, and it becomes a little bit of a hot mess like we're seeing up on the screen. So the other thing that's an issue is that besides the volume of flags we have here, all of these flags kind of do different things, and they can stay in your code base for different lengths of time. There's different rules that apply to them, right? So your feature was a release toggle. You wanted to roll it out. This flag over here is a kill switch. So this is intended to stop something in production if it's tanking, something's going wrong. You want to kill your feature in production. This one over here is an experiment. It's testing something out between two different groups. This one's an opt-in, so if the feature is on, the user is getting the feature. Meanwhile, this one over here is an opt-out. So if the feature is on, they're not getting the feature. So they're all very different, and they all form together to find this one very jumbled mess, don't know what's going on. So obviously a problem. How do we fix that? Or rather, the question that we're going to answer today is what's the best way to do feature flags? So that's what we're really trying to figure out. Why do I want to answer that question, right? Why do we care? So I'm a software engineer. I work for a company called Optimizely. Optimizely is an experimentation platform, which sounds very buzzwordy. But the most important thing is that we have a feature flagging product that we work on. So I specifically work on this feature flagging product. I use feature flags in my day-to-day. I hack on feature flags, and I also talk to people who use feature flags. So just for this presentation, I spoke to a lot of people about feature flags. Some back-end software engineers, some front-end, some SDK, some PMs, some people in management, like a director of development, some people after the sales cycle, like a sales engineer or solutions architect, and then also some people like in DevOps or in quality assurance. So spoke to a lot of people trying to figure out what is the best way to do feature flags or what is the right way to do it. And hopefully learn some things that I can share with you guys. All right, so we spoke about feature flags and we spoke about some people. Now, what happens when we put those together? This is kind of the fun part, right? What can go wrong? Let's talk about that first. So we can go into the lowest risk scenario first. Let's start at the low end and talk about that, right? So inherently, we're putting tech debt into our code base when we put in a feature flag, right? So we're increasing the complexity, the tech debt, and we're making it harder for engineers to understand the code and understand what's going wrong. So if we look at these two little pieces of code here that don't make any sense, the one on the left kind of hard to figure out what's going on, right? I mean, obviously it's more lines than the other one, but you guys have no idea what's happening because you don't know if that feature flag is on or off, right? No idea what's going on the left. On the right, obviously we know what's going on. We're gonna do something. Great. So we can see that it makes it a little bit harder for engineers to understand the code, even in those like 4 lines of code. Now let's multiply that. So I took a look at our own code base. We have over 40 instances of feature flags in our own code base, and each of them are pretty big. So they're all gating like thousands of lines of code. If we multiply the confusion that we felt before by that, we're getting into a little bit of a situation here. The next thing to talk about is that taking out a feature flag kind of sucks. So I don't know if anybody's ever tried to do this. This is a real PR that I worked on with a feature. Just the PR to take out the feature flag was over 1,000 lines of code. Generated a lot of conversation on GitHub. And also spent over 60 days in the code base. So not a fun time for anyone involved. All right, so that was just like not really the highest risk scenario. We're really only affecting engineers. We're not affecting our customers. We're just pissing some engineers off, right? So let's talk about a little bit more of a higher risk scenario where we're actually affecting our customers. So we can actually have performance impacts on our system from using feature flags. And let's talk about that. You know, what happens when your feature is broken, your feature isn't implemented right, or you know what, your feature just tanks. It sucks, nobody likes it. An improperly monitored feature flag once added a really big performance hit to one of our own APIs. We had a feature flag, they didn't implement it right, and it added 48 seconds to our API time. I don't know how like patient this crew is, but not a good thing, right? So yeah, it can have performance impacts on your system, and if you're not monitoring it, you can't really tell what those performance impacts are. All right, so now we've gone to like the highest risk scenario. I know you guys are like, okay, how bad can this actually get? Like, you're really exaggerating here. It can actually get pretty bad, apparently. So does anybody know the story of Knight Capital Group? Okay, some of you might. They used to be a financial services group. Keyword there is used. So in 2012, they were the largest trader in US equities, and they were trading $21 billion every day, right? So largest trader, I think 17% on like the New York Stock Exchange. At 9:30 a.m. on August 1st, they had $365 million in assets. It's a lot of money. By 10:15 a.m., they did not anymore. And they were in bankruptcy, had a $460 million loss. Be like, why? I'll tell you. They had deployed code that repurposed an old feature flag, right? But they forgot, or they didn't forget, but they accidentally did not remove the old code. So we have a feature flag that's all of a sudden on, activating old code that didn't get removed. So what did this old code do? It continuously processed orders without stopping. So they're a trading company, not a great thing as a trading company. So for 45 minutes, went wild, processed all these orders, amounted to $460 million, and they were bankrupt in 45 minutes. So pretty big deal, pretty big consequences. If you want a nice little, visual of that, this is their stock. Not the direction you want your stock to be going in. Okay, so we've talked about, kind of the risks that can be associated with mismanaging your feature flags. And now you're all scared. You're like, oh no, we're going bankrupt. No. We're gonna be intentional about how we deploy with feature flags, right? How can I mitigate these risks by being intentional about how I'm deploying my code using feature flags? So it all goes back to intention, because really you used a feature flag because you wanted to be intentional when you wrote the code. That's literally why you put the feature flag in. And now why aren't we being intentional about controlling these feature flags? Kind of makes sense. So let's talk about some best practices. The words I want to focus on are visibility and accountability, right? So let's talk about visibility first. Basically, I want you to stalk your flags. Like, go home, I want you to figure out what they're doing, where they are, all time, day or night. For every single flag, you should know the state, the history, the metrics, and the expiration date at any given time. The state's pretty easy. It's just a feature flag. Is it on or off? History can be a little bit more specific to, the flags that you use, the types of flags, the things that you're looking for. So for every single flag, you want to know, when did it last change? Why did it change? Who changed it? What's the history overall of the flag? So is it on or off? Rollout percentage? Who is it being targeted to? These are all super important things to know historically about your system. The next thing we want to look at is, are there metrics around this flag, right? So is it being used? How many times has it been evaluated? When was the last time it was evaluated? Is this gating dead code, or is it still useful? And then you also want to have some metrics around, its success or failure. So is this flag tanking? Is it improperly implemented? Things like that. Expiration dates are super important too. You want to know, when does this flag need to be removed and who's responsible for removing it for every single flag. Next thing you want to think about is collaboration, right? So other people might be using your flag. You're not existing in a vacuum, like we saw with Knight Capital Group. Other people could be using your flag either now or in the future. So the cool thing about a feature flag is that it can turn what used to be like code and engineering decision, deploying your feature into the world, into a business decision, right? You deploy it whenever you want, and then they turn it on. But you might not be the one flipping the switch. So we need to think about other people when we're starting to implement our feature flag. There's a couple things to think about. What needs to be gated behind this flag? There might be docs or marketing materials or things from other teams that might necessarily not have to do with what you're doing. Also, who's controlling the flag? Is it you? Is it a developer? Is it a release team? Is it the PM? You have to think about all these things before you put them in the code. And then also, who needs to be notified of this change? There might be other teams that you're affecting with your work, and you need to make sure that they're aware of it before you roll it out, obviously. So there's a pretty low-tech, low-budget tech stack for this, and that is just find your flags, look for them, search. And then also just track your flags in like a shared spreadsheet, track the history. You can have a whiteboard. It's basically a pretty easy way to do all of this stuff. If you are implementing this yourself or you're looking for a solution, this is just something like I built. It's basically answering the same questions, right? You're taking all of your flags and answering, where's the flags? Is it being used? When does it expire? In like a dashboard kind of scenario. Same questions, just maybe a little bit more automatic. But the important thing is that you're thinking through all of these questions when you're designing the system. Okay, so we've talked about visibility. Now we should hopefully have a very visible system. We know where all our flags are. We stock them. We want to be accountable for our flags, right? There's kind of two pieces of intent, which is one, like I planned what I'm going to do, and the next part is like I'm actually going to do it. Otherwise, what's the point? For every single flag, you should be tracking it in a shared place, like we talked about before, but make sure that every person who's a stakeholder in this has access to the information. You need alerting set up on your monitoring and your metrics. That one's seen a lot of monitoring that does not have alerting set up to it. So if you're not going to be alerting anybody and just screaming into a void, it's not really very useful. The next thing is a lot of accountability for feature flags is more around like the procedure that you're going to use. So you want to decide as a team or as a company, what are the procedures I'm going to use when I'm managing my feature flagging program? Who owns managing your features as a whole? Who's in charge of this program, right? Is it a release team? Is it a PM? Is it an engineering manager? Who's in charge overall? The next thing you might want to decide as a company is, are you going to think about something like a WIP limit, like a work in progress limit? Some companies will limit the number of features they have in flight at any given time. It's also a thought for feature flags. You might want to limit the number of feature flags you have at any given time. So my team has a work in progress limit of 2 features at any given time. Probably shouldn't have more than 2 feature flags because our features tend to be a little bit bigger in the code base. So the most important thing here is that we're considering feature flags work in flight, and we're thinking about how much work in flight do we want to have at any given time. And another way to think about this is that the people feeling the consequences of tech debt are not always the people prioritizing the work. So if you have something like a limit on the number of feature flags you're putting in your code base, that'll prioritize or encourage some people who are prioritizing removing feature flags before we move on. Okay, another thing you might want to think about as a company is, do you have a feature flag checklist? Is there a checklist of must-dos that everybody has to think about before you implement a feature, right? So What tracking do you need? What procedure do you need to follow? What kind of changes should not be behind a feature flag? You know, if you have destructive database changes or things like that, those should not be behind a feature flag. Just kind of like a list of things that everybody should be thinking about before they put a feature flag in. That's a great thing to have as a company. And then another thing to think about is the lifespan. So there's a lot of different kinds of feature flags. How long can any type of feature flag stay in your code base, right? So for shorter lived flags, you might want to think about, you know, is it a day, is it a week, is it a month? For longer lived flags, maybe you have them, maybe you don't. These are just things that you need to think about. And then if you're thinking about, you know, how long can any type of flag stay in your code base, it probably depends on how long does your system take to get meaningful results back from that feature flag. So, you know, maybe if your feature is getting a lot of traffic, you could be done in an hour in a day. Maybe if it's not, you're going to want to leave it in there, roll out slower, do something for a week or a month. The important thing is that you're thinking about it, and also if you instituted one of these limits on, you know, the time that a feature flag can be in the code base, if somebody goes over that, they have to have a reason. You've introduced kind of like a barrier where they have to have a reason to go over it. Cool. So now let's talk about expired features. When do they need to come out? So we're going to try and prioritize removing flags as a part of the work of the feature. So saying the feature is not done until the feature flag has come out. So that's pretty important for getting this work prioritized. And then you're going to want to retire flags which are expired, or also if they're unused. So that's where visibility comes really into play. If you know if flags are never being used, you can take them out. Cool. So how do I make sure expired features are removed? Couple simple ways. You could have a feature stand-up where you take a look every week, see which flags need to come out, see which flags are expiring, make sure to notify the teams that are responsible. You could also just ticket the flag removal when you put the flag into your code base. Super simple. And then the most extreme of these is you could write the PR to take the feature flag out when you put it in. So if that's possible for your code base, totally go ahead and do that. And then the last thing to remember is that a lot of these are procedural changes, right? So like with any procedural change, it's important that, you know, you're reviewing this process with other people who have a stake in it. You're gaining buy-in from, you know, your team, your company, and you're communicating these standards widely throughout your company once you decided upon them. Cool. And then just some other like general rules of thumb. They might not apply to you depending on what specifically you're doing with feature flags, but just in general, probably best to keep flags as small as possible and also as short-lived as possible. Just makes sense. It's going to be easier to rip it out if you have the context and also it's kind of small. And then also, you're going to want to think about trying to keep them as top level as possible. So if you can bubble feature flags up to the highest point they can live in the code base, it's a lot easier to, you know, test in branching scenarios when the branch is up here instead of like a bunch of little branches down the line. Cool. So summary, we're going to manage our feature flags. Otherwise, bad things can happen, as we learned. And then we're going to follow some best practices, right? So we're going to have a very visible system, stalk our flags, and be accountable for the things that we see in our system. So we're going to monitor and alert on our flags and retire the flags when they're no longer being used. Cool. And with that said, hopefully we're all going to go from this hot mess of feature flags to this beautifully organized, you know, feature flag system. Thank you.